For Session Update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. On Thursday, Governor Mark Dayton called a press conference to mark the progress thus far on the Water Quality Buffer Initiative. He was joined by the DNR Commissioner, the Commissioner of Agriculture, individuals representing soil and water, and a Dakota County farmer who has witnessed improved water quality due to the buffer strips on his land. Following prepared remarks, Governor Dayton took questions from the press on other topics. Here's that press conference.
Here to report some very good news on the progress that has been made to implement the state's buffer legislation, and its progress has preceded even the deadlines of this November for public waters, and then the following November 2018 for public ditches. And I want to thank the many, many farmers who are here who have participated in this endeavor, and in fact, many of them started long before I even understood the importance of buffers, and before this legislation, as well as other landowners, as well as local officials, one of whom is here today, to talk about how they worked together cooperatively, constructively to advance this important cause. Is beyond the legislation. This is about protecting the water of Minnesota for ourselves, for our neighbors downstream, and for future generations. The picture over here, to me, says it all. I remember going with Ken Salazar, the Secretary of the Department of Interior, a couple of years ago, on a boat coming up north then from the Mississippi, which is the water on the right. And you see where the Minnesota River converges with the Mississippi River, and the contrast in water is just staggering. That's all runoff, most of it's runoff from various activities along the Minnesota River before it gets to the Mississippi River. This is our state. You know, the Mississippi, well, Minnesota originates with in South Dakota, so I suppose we can blame them for a good part of this, should. But, I mean, seriously, this is our state. This is our water. This is our responsibility. And I have a really hard time with people who are now saying, well, we can just delay this for another year or so, because, you know, it doesn't really matter. Let's just delay improving water quality for another year. It isn't going to affect anybody. It does affect a lot of people, very, very seriously. And again, I just thank so much people like Becky and Dave who have taken the lead. And he's got a St. Olaf student who is working on the buffers this summer. Maybe next summer you can put me to work. I could use the exercise. But so I'd like to ask them to speak first about their experiences with this initiative, and then to have our commissioners talk about what the agencies have been doing to make this effective for all over this and work well for people all over the state. So Becky, welcome.
My name is Becky Alexander. I work with the Cottonwood Soil and Water Conservation District down in Windham, Minnesota. And I just want to reflect a little bit on how the perspective has been from the soil and water conservation districts. The tools developed by DNR and Bowser have helped us immensely in our effort to assist landowners with the buffer law. The DNR buffer mapping tool was very simple to use in order to enter in comments from staff and landowners over the last year to help shape the map for our county. And the changes have been reflected now in this most current map update. And now, like many other offices throughout the state, we're working diligently with our landowners and their buffer needs. And the Bowser BuffCat tool to help us track towards compliance has helped us to target and prioritize those efforts. In Cottonwood County, I have just over 1,500 parcels that are affected by this first deadline for the public waters. Yesterday, my staff member and I found that we have 69% compliant, as they are. And that other 31%, I believe, more and more will become compliant as landowners continue to enroll in programs like CRP, as we make site visits out in the field later this spring and summer and fall, and as we learn more from these landowners about the fields surrounding these riparian areas. Our aerial imagery is from 2015. When a landowner plants grass last year, I don't see that right now. So the more I learn from them as we contact them, the more I think we'll find compliant. And a majority of our buffer compliance concerns aren't a result of a landowner having zero buffer. They have buffers. They meet the 50-foot average oftentimes, but what we find is as that stream winds through their field and that stream may bow back in towards their farm field edge, they're short that 30-foot minimum. And when that happens, we're talking about hundredths to tenths of an acre to make that parcel compliant. Has our journey so far been without some bumps? No, we've had bumps and we've had some hiccups, but overall, implementation of the buffer law for our county especially has been working well and is on its way to success for our Soil and Water Conservation District. Thank you.
I'm Dave Legvold. I am a farmer from far southern Dakota County, as well as a retired environmental educator. And I've learned that you never retire from farming. I am pleased to be a member of the farming community to speak about buffers and the way they work for clean water. I have seen the effects of the buffer on my farm and how it works, but I really needed to make decisions based on sound science. And so I've been able to team up with a scientist from St. Olaf College who is in her senior year, and she has spent virtually the whole summer out on the buffer investigating the efficacy of what's called a saturated buffer. And I'd better stop now and let Sophie explain what she was doing.
Well, it's kind of complicated. But it's essentially working with having all of the water going, all of the agricultural runoff being sucked into this perforated tile that's running parallel or running into the buffer, and all of the agricultural runoff that is going into the buffer is not only going into the stream, but a lot of it is being filtered by the vegetation in the buffer. And so that's essentially the idea. So a lot of the tile coming in from the agricultural field, part of it is perforated and running kind of below the buffer so that all of that water, all of that nitrate-ridden water is being intaken by vegetation and roots.
So Sophie, do we have all the answers yet?
Definitely not.
That is why we are part way home in this process. But what I've learned also is that the agricultural community, farmers and landowners, were not able or not willing to do it on their own. And so when we had Governor Dayton's administration step up, and now we can both step forward and get this process accomplished. And so I believe that partnership is the watchword in getting this job done.
Very good. Good morning. I'm John Jaski, Director of Board of Water and Soil Resources, and our agency's responsibility is to, assist and oversee this law, and we do that by working with and through local governments, because this initiative, like all conservation programs that work with private landowners, needs to be done at the local level. And you heard from Becky at the Soil and Water Conservation District, and those folks are all around the state doing that very thing, working with landowners to make this law work well for them. A little bit more of a background on what buffers do. Of course, they are a water quality practice, and you heard from Sophie, how that works on a specific farm, Mr. Legvold's farm, and those practices can work on any farm or any landscape. We have options in addition to the buffers if, in fact, a buffer isn't the thing that's going to do the job. But a buffer does two things. It treats the water as it flows off the land in a sheet flow, and real flat landscape. The water goes through the buffer and it gets treated before it enters the lake, the river, or the ditch. The buffer also provides a function in holding the bank together with the root mass. Those are the two things that a buffer does. And if the landscape has been altered, either naturally or if you got unusual topography, other practices can be used that will treat water quality in the same way that a buffer would otherwise do it. So we also have that information that is being used by the Soil and Water Conservation Districts to help landowners with choices that will fit their landscape. Up here you see this map that was referred to already. Becky and her colleagues across the state have been looking at where the buffers are in place already, and this map indicates that on a county-by-county basis. And of course, you know that some of those buffers, as she indicated, have already been there. Many have been there naturally, many were put in by farmers, and of course they put in other practices as well in many places. But this shows a status to date. They've used this map prepared by the DNR as the underpinning, and this is an inventory of where a buffer in a preliminary way is already compliant with the law. This map, or the future versions of it, will show increases in buffers being in place for two reasons. One, as Becky described, they will be doing field reviews to check these, and she indicated how they've done this work over the past few months has been through aerial images, that have been available to them, but as she indicated, some of them aren't up to current time frames, so they will be going on the ground to verify those estimates. And of course, landowners will still be putting in more buffers. They'll be beginning again this spring and again this summer and fall, so we will see these numbers increase over time. And again, what landowners have for options are really several, and they start with visiting the Soil and Water Conservation District and asking them about what those things could be, both in terms of financial assistance or technical assistance to get the buffers installed. So with that, I'll have Commissioner Landwehr come up and talk about the mapping work.
Good morning. I'm Tom Landwehr. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources. DNR had a fairly small role in the buffers initiative here. Our job was to do the map, produce the map that would identify where buffers are needed in the state. So we used some existing maps that the Department of Natural Resources had to identify protected public waters inventory water bodies, and then we used oftentimes paper maps that local units of government had that identified public ditch systems. We put all that into an interactive map that's now out there. It's complete. It's ready to use. It's available on the DNR website, www.mndnr.gov, and anybody can see it, but it is now being used for implementation statewide. It was a big job creating this because many of these maps had never been digitally produced. They were always on paper. We put the draft map out for public comment 1 year ago in March of 2016. We did receive ultimately 4,200, almost 4,200 individual comments on the map. People were able to check it, check for accuracy. We subsequently did more than 700 field visits. Eventually 2,800 individual changes were made to those maps. And about 50 of those comments are still considered open. They have not yet been resolved. So out of 4,200, about 50 are still sort of unresolved. Most of the changes to the map included minor adjustments for location of the water body. The digital map was off some, or there had been some small change. And in some cases, we actually had mapped areas that no longer were public water. So they were being plowed through. There was no bed and bank. There was no indication of a stream there. We took that off the map. So most of those corrections have been resolved, and most of the comments have been completely addressed. At this point, DNR is just going to continue to maintain that map. It is considered final at this point, but we will adjust it over time as conditions change and continue to make it available for the local units of government to implement. So we're very pleased with that. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Commissioner of Agriculture, Dave Frederickson.
Thanks, Tom. I'm Dave Frederickson. I serve as Commissioner of Agriculture. I'm so impressed with the map. I'm impressed with the fact that over 74% of the farms across this state are now between 60 and 80% compliant. Those numbers speak volumes about the commitment, I believe, that Minnesota agriculture, Minnesota farmers have to water quality. Let me talk a little bit more specifically about one of the alternative practices that we have in addition to CRP, in addition to the CREP program that Governor Dayton and others have worked very hard on to put into place here in Minnesota. We have the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program. To date, we have 356 farms signed into that program encompassing 206,000 acres. We have 619 new conservation practices on those farms. So in other words, we're not certifying farms that have it all done and they're ready to go. We're out there working with farm by farm to make sure that practices on the land result in cleaner water. I have always been committed to conservation from a farm by farm, acre by acre perspective, and we are doing that with Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program. We have an obligation, I believe, in Minnesota, we are a headwater state, and we have an obligation to make sure that the water leaving our state is clean, and thanks to the governor and his efforts, we're well on the road to accomplishing that. I know the governor will point out a couple of things that are happening during this legislative session in terms of some assistance to assist farmers in establishing buffers. And so with that, I will pass it back to Governor Dayton.
Thank you, Commissioner. The real credit belongs to farmers like Dave and his young scientific associates who can explain things that I don't understand so well, and Sophie and also Becky in terms of local initiatives. I mean, this didn't happen because of words on a piece of paper making a law. This happened because people recognize the need, the urgent need to improve our water quality, and their willingness to take their responsibility for doing their part to make that happen. So, again, I thank everybody here for their initiative, and I know Commissioner Frederickson has had to endure some challenging moments, but I thank you for that, for standing strong on what's in the best interest of all Minnesotans, which is better water quality. With that, we'll throw it open to any questions on this subject.
Well, Governor, or perhaps Commissioner Frederickson, we've got about 3/4 of the counties that are 60 to 100% compliant. How difficult is it to bring in that across the finish line by the deadlines? I mean, do we still have significant challenges there?
I think it's totally possible. I mean, we're human beings. We can accomplish this. It's not rocket science to put in a buffer. And I know that farmers have the ability, and will continue to move forward, Bill, with the process.
And this is a process. You know, soil and water conservation districts, as John Jaski said, and others are working with landowners, farmers and other landowners, to make this work and make it flexible and make it responsive to their particular situations. In DNR, was it over 2,600? Yeah, well, but how many changes?
2,800 changes.
Anybody who says the government's not responsive to its constituents, over 2,800 changes were made in their original mapping in response to over 4,200 comments that were received. And so everybody's really bending over backwards, as they should, as we all should, to make this work as effectively as possible. Is it going to be perfect? No. But the perfect's the enemy of the very good. And what we've put together so far is very good, and it's going to get better as we progress together.
Commissioner Frederickson, could I ask you to clarify something, please? You mentioned that you've got, right over here, Tim.
Gotcha.
You mentioned that you put in place 600 new conservation practices on farms. Are you talking about just 600 farms where you've had new conservation practices, or are these 600 different kinds of models and practices?
I got it. We've established those practices on 356 farms that are total 206,000 acres. And we've established 619 practices on those farms.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Governor, you mentioned that there's legislation moving through to push off some of these deadlines. Are you open to that, or is that something that you're just trying to resist?
No. First of all, there's not cause. We made compromises on this legislation. I made compromise. Took private ditches out 2 years ago thinking that would satisfy the critics. No. I came back last year, we made some modifications, and now it's more. More is never enough. And people who want to delay this because it's not perfect are basically say, well, it doesn't matter if we just delay it another year. You know, water quality is sort of an optional issue. Discretionary concern of government. And it just, you sticking your head in the sand or in the riverbank is not a responsible way to deal with the reality of the situation. Look at that picture. That's our responsibility. And our responsibility, again, thanks to so many farmers and other landowners, is already being undertaken. So why would we tell those who have already taken the initiative that what they're doing doesn't make a very, very important difference to our state? And they should just, back off for another year? It's really unreasonable, and it's unconscionable to expect a delay for this to go forward. And if there are problems, glitches, we'll understand on the basis of actual experience, and we'll come back next year and work out the refinements to make it better. But to delay it or to weaken it is not acceptable and not negotiable.
Other questions on this topic?
It looks from the map that western Minnesota, and particularly northwestern Minnesota, is less compliant than other parts of the state. Is there any reason for that that's going on in those areas?
Each of the counties, of course, has got their own approach to this. And so I want to make sure you understand this is a very preliminary estimate using technology that is remote, right? No one's got on the ground to check these things. And one of the things that's most difficult to check with a satellite image is the width of a ditch buffer, which is 16.5 feet or 1 rod. So in order to be certain about whether it's 16.5 feet or not, you really do have to go on the ground. So one thing I would say is that we do need to make sure where we have a lot of ditches that we get field work done to verify these numbers.
And those are now recorded until November of 18. Thank you. Again, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Long trip. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, nothing's going on these days, so I don't expect to be any other questions.
Governor, the Senate vote last night, obviously, on the reinsurance plan, and then you got a letter, you and legislative leaders got a letter from the CEOs of the 5 major HMOs in Minnesota. Are there assurances, you talked earlier about what kind of assurances you want for the state enacts reinsurance, are those adequate?
I've written a letter to the CEOs, which I'm signing, I believe, right after this news conference, so we'll distribute it to you very shortly. No, I'm not satisfied with their responses. I'm not satisfied with their commitments. We're talking about $300 million of public money per year to provide this reinsurance, and I think we have people in Minnesota have a right to know, is this going to mean that people who are now providing this coverage are going to continue to do so for 2018? And are the rates they're going to charge going to be ones that are going to be reduced to zero or close to zero, the increases, as a result of this legislation? So that very much remains unanswered, and I think needs to be answered before the conference committee can certainly resolve its issues. And the other is how to pay for it. I stressed before, and I put in this letter, and I'll press again with the conference committee, this ought to be paid for by the industry through some kind of assessment made, as it was used to fund MSHA before. So it has a precedent. But $300 million a year out of the general fund, or as the Senate bill proposes, in part out of the reserve fund, is unsustainable. And you look at $300 million per year, $600 million to the biennium. Right away the surplus is going to be seriously impacted, and then if it's going to be kept on going, it's really unsustainable. So those are my major concerns.
There is not an explicit threat there, but there is, at least if you read between the lines, some indication that if this doesn't happen, reinsurance, that we may see more insurers leave the private market, or there be less options available. Are they twisting the arm of the state to try to get reinsurance?
I'm not going to describe motives. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens in actuality. I think this will pass. I'm very disappointed that and then we'll see what happens as a result. I was very disappointed the Minnesota Care buy-in did not pass the Senate. It failed by just one vote, but I was impressed by the fact that the one physician in the Minnesota Senate, Dr. Jensen, voted in favor of it. And he said that it addresses the very issue of access, of having a choice of providers for people, particularly in greater Minnesota. For a body that claims that they have the priorities of greater Minnesota first and foremost at their heart, they didn't act that way last night. And I was very disappointed that one of the fellow members of the Senate was not present for the vote. But the fact that I appreciate what Senator Jensen did, and again, his expertise is particularly valuable in this situation.
Other questions?
Governor, there's a bill up in the House today that would remove the default language in state law regarding teacher layoffs and require local districts to negotiate a new plan. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that proposal. You've been opposed to LIFO changes before. Is this something you may consider?
No, I remain opposed. I think if they want to encourage school districts to negotiate their own agreements, which many of them have done, that's one thing. But to substitute LIFO for traditional means of determining layoffs as the default, I oppose.
You're issuing your revised budget, I think, tomorrow. The Senate is coming out with its tax number today. Where do you think this leaves the debate going forward?
The tax number?
Their tax cut number, that they're putting out what they want to do with tax cuts.
They have put out?
They're planned to this afternoon.
Oh, yeah, this afternoon? I didn't know that. Okay. See, we...
Was it at the same time, but then your news conference moved them back?
Well, ours tomorrow on our supplemental. I don't know what the numbers are. We'll have to see. Yeah.
They're going to bid higher than you on the tax cut number. Are you planning to move up your tax cut number as part of your budget tomorrow?
I'm not making any commitment to anything, and I'm not going to comment on my proposal tomorrow. But you know, they got to make all this thing work. Here's $600 million biennium for reinsurance. And I'm told they want to take money out for transportation. And I'm told there are other initiatives related to education that they do support, some of which are in my budget. So, I mean, I want to see how their numbers work. Now, for the next biennium and then for the biennium following. You know, we have worked so hard in the last 6 years to reestablish fiscal integrity and stability in Minnesota government. And we have structural surplus now for the next 2 biennia following this one. And I'm not going to walk out the door in January of 2019 leaving my successor the kind of deficit situation that I encountered. And I won't allow that to happen.
Governor, President Trump has outlined the federal budget, and we're beginning to get the details of that. Do you remain concerned that the legislature needs to be very cautious about what's coming?
And that's an excellent point, which I should have made too. Yes, absolutely. The uncertainty now of what the federal government is going to do and not do, both in terms of initiatives like the health initiative, which has already been discussed, and the clean water initiative, other environmental initiatives, but also then you take Medicaid, which remains a federal law, and if they shift keep the statutory requirements as well as what I think are the moral requirements to provide quality health care to people. If that's maintained and the funding is cut as drastically from the federal government as being proposed, the state's going to have no choice but to either raise their expenditures beyond most of our means and reduce recipients or the quality of care provided to recipients. It's a terrible box that they're trying to force, Speaker Ryan and others are trying to force the states into, and it's why Republican governors as well as Democrat governors have expressed their strong objections. And you look at those numbers that came out of CBO, which have been verified according to Politico by an internal document in the White House in terms of the 16 million, or in this other case, 14 million people would lose their insurance next year and 24 million in a decade. I mean, that should be end of discussion right there. I mean, how could anybody responsibly look at legislation that would have that effect on the people of this country? It's just, it boggles my mind. So they can raise military spending and cut taxes for the wealthiest people in this country? I mean, that's what this is all wrapped up in. It's all wrapped up in in their budget politics and in their willingness to put tax cuts for people who don't need them ahead of health care for people who do need it. And it's shameful.
Governor, the Senate Republicans haven't released any details, but they do say they will be offering tax relief for every single Minnesotan under their plan they're going to release this afternoon. Does that sound realistic, given all of the uncertainty?
I can't say until I've seen the details. But you know, this fallacy that continues, that we raise taxes on every Minnesotan and therefore we should reduce them, is just untrue. We raise tax rates on the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans and nobody else. The other 98% of the same tax rates, the same income levels factored for inflation that have been in existence since 2001. We haven't raised the sales tax. We haven't raised taxes on people. We have the surplus because of the, mostly because of the tax on the 2%, the fourth tier. That's $1.4 billion next biennium, $1.6 billion projected surplus. That's tax revenues from the wealthiest 2%. It took us from a chronic deficit situation into a surplus situation, that combined with the economic recovery that we've seen across the state. They opposed the 2%. So for them to claim now that it misrepresent the source of this additional revenue, this surplus, and pretend that they're doing some essential public service to give everybody a tax reduction, which most people will receive with federal conformity and some of the other changes that have been made, is just untruthful.
Any other questions?
Governor, there's a hearing, a Forest Service holding a hearing in Duluth today on withdrawing about 250,000 acres of federal land from the list for possible mineral leases. The Twin Metals is on that, Poly that isn't. Do you have any thoughts about this move?
Well, I'll take my position on Twin Metals, and I think that's been the focus of the federal initiatives, and that would be a 2-year moratorium, and then all of the other, the much broader. I haven't looked at the consequences of the much broader. I haven't looked at the geography. I'm not going to comment on that, but I do believe that the federal government has taken a responsible and necessary position to protect what would be irreparable damage to the boundary waters.
This year for last year, and according to them, lobbyist groups spent at least $64 million to lobby Minnesota officials. Have you felt the impact of that lobbying? In the $64 million, is that a problem in any way?
I don't know what it's been before. I mean, I know that all you have to do is walk down the corridors here, and you see a lot of people here who are not volunteering themselves. So I mean, it's a question of balance. People have a right to representation, yes, but if the only people who are represented here are people with the money to pay somebody to do it for them, then that becomes a problem, and that skews legislation. And when when I look at some of the things that are being proposed because of the pressure from certain lobbying groups, if you ask the people in Minnesota, do you want to delay water quality improvements for another year? I don't think you'd get a very strong support for that. But then there's a bill because certain paid lobbyists represent a small handful of people who object for whatever reason get traction. So I think it's a problem. I don't know if it's growing. I don't know how it's growing. But again, it's a question of balance.
Governor, you have selected the Gophers to go all the way in the NCAA. Will you explain the genius behind your
We geniuses have a hard time explaining our geniuses. And I'm picking the Gopher women's hockey team to win the national championship too. 2 more games to go. I just what can I say? Brilliant insight. and a little hope. And Wisconsin loses in the first round, which is just almost as good.
Were you aware that Governor Scott Walker picked Wisconsin to go all the way?
Is that right? Well. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.